this. Okay. There it goes. Okay. So for my Berlin Tale project, I focused on Soviet and communist architecture in Berlin. But it's hard to accurately convey what buildings look like through a paper. So I decided that the easiest way to talk about Soviet architecture would be to do a guided tour of Karl-Marx-Allee through Google Earth, which obviously is not as great as actually taking video while we were there, but it's pretty good. So we're just going to go to Street View over here, and we are going to start walking as soon as it loads. There it goes. Here we are. We're on Frankfurter Tor. This is the very beginning of Karl-Marx-Allee, and these two towers, which were designed by Hermann Henselmann in the early 1950s, are classic examples of Stalinist architecture. Um, Stalinist architecture is essentially it's a very grandiose Soviet style of architecture. And as you can see up here, you have these pillars and the dome's top, and these really rather ornate facades, as you can clearly see right here with this balcony and the pillars that go with it. It really seems to fly in the face of the whole, the usual conception, anyway, of what we think Eastern Bloc buildings are, and that's the usual prefabricated, uh, functionalist apartment block. And this entire avenue was not really meant to convey some sort of functionalist, people are meant to live here thing. The GDR government obviously promoted this as a sort of workers' paradise, but no one who actually lived here was a worker. And here we'll move up and we can look at some of these apartments, of these Stalinist era apartments. I mean, look at how absurdly ornate the facade of this building is. There is no way that anyone living here was actually a worker, especially considering that in the early 1950s, much of East Berlin was still in ruins. Overall, all along this avenue, these Stalinist-style apartments only held about 7,000 people total. That's not a lot of people in a city of several million. And there was a chronic housing shortage throughout East Berlin and, frankly, the entire Soviet bloc. But that obviously didn't really matter to Stalin or any of his subordinates. Stalin himself wasn't really all that concerned with egalitarian uh, beliefs. A lot of those original Bolshevik egalitarian ideas were abandoned during his reign. It was during his reign that uh, different pay scales for workers began to appear. Communist Party officials began to get much nicer housing, and ooh, here's a good example down here on the left of this. My God, there's no way anyone could afford this. The people who were living along this avenue were probably almost certainly people who had connections to the German Communist, well, the Socialist Unity Party of East Germany. No workers were living here. And it's frankly not all that surprising that this type of architecture appeared in East Berlin, not only because when they were built Stalin was in power, but because the leader of the GDR, Ulbricht, was a Stalinist as well. Okay. Um, of course, that didn't stop the GDR government from proclaiming this section of East Berlin as a workers' paradise. I mean, this was the place that they would bring foreign observers to look at, to show them how great life in the German Democratic Republic really was. I mean, of course, it really wasn't that excellent, but from this street, it's hard to tell. one of the things that really defined the Eastern Bloc and East Germany as well was a lack of consumer goods. But if there's one thing that this avenue has, it's an abundance of stores. And these stores that are here today obviously weren't there at the time. But state-run stores, this entire avenue was filled with state-run stores where you could probably get the best quality goods in all of East Berlin. If you couldn't get it on this avenue, then you sure as hell weren't going to be able to get it anywhere else in Berlin, if not the entire country. This was the center of what little consumer culture East Berlin had. And with these storefronts, you can oops, what's going on here? Stop it. With these storefronts, you can actually see I'm sorry, what is going on? Let's go back to Street View. Okay. With these storefronts, you can actually see a very clear German influence on the buildings. Now, I don't know what's going on up here with this glitchy view, but you can clearly see with these buildings is that there is a distinct separation between the storefront and the apartments above. And here we go. And here's a good example of that. You can clearly see that the facade of the storefront is different from the facade of the apartments above. And this type of architecture, not exactly the pillars and stuff like that, but the concept of separating the first floor stores with the upper story apartments was actually pioneered by an Austrian in turn of the century Vienna named Otto Wagner, who really pioneered this concept of a separate space for stores and a separate space for living quarters. And so in this sense, the apartments that we see alongside Karl-Marx-Allee, then Stalin-Allee, is there's a very clear German influence in this essentially Soviet-style architecture. These stores that we see down here is not something that we would see in a more classic example of Stalinist architecture, say the Seven Sisters in Moscow. And we're just going to skip to the end of this section of the road because it's quicker. Here we're going to go to Strassburger Platz, and we can see the end of the Stalinist era road. So you can tell it's a little bit decrepit now. At the time, there's no way that this place would have been allowed to, disintegrate to this point. The East Germans published a series, I think it was 16 Principles of City Building, and one of those principles really emphasized the importance of wide open public spaces, and Strassburger Platz is an excellent example of that. There used to be a statue of Stalin here. Obviously, that is no longer here. It would have been removed in the early 60s, late 50s, after Khrushchev denounced Stalin. And here we can see these two towers, and these two towers over here, I think. No, hang on, I'm sorry. That mark the entrance to Strassburger Platz. And these two towers act as a sort of gateway to the avenue. And of course, we could have seen that at the other end of the avenue as well in Frankfurter Tor. And it's a very stereotypical Stalinist design. You can see it in Moscow, you can see it in Minsk. There are many cities in Eastern Europe that adopted this sort of dual tower and then open plaza design. Now, once Stalin died in 1953, he was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev, a few years after cementing his power, denounced Stalin and most of the things that he stood for in his secret speech to the Communist Party. And it's during that time that Stalinist architecture, like we've seen, was abandoned in favor of a more functional design. And it's with de-Stalinization that we get the stereotypical prefabricated housing units that everyone is used to. And with these, as you can see here, they aren't as, actually, hang on, what am I doing? They aren't as ornate as the structures that were built in the early 1950s. And this is largely because Khrushchev wanted to solve the housing problem, which had been a huge problem since the end of the war. And Stalin never really went out of his way to solve that. And Ulbricht, who would generally do whatever the Soviet Union asked him to do, followed suit. And this is when we really began to see the modernist return into East German architecture. That's not to say that some aspects of Stalinist architecture didn't survive. This type of art here that we see on the side of this hotel, which was designed for the Communist Party in the 1970s, this mural depicts idealized life in a socialist society, which doesn't really fit in with the narrative of a functionalist building. A true functionalist building wouldn't have such a mural at all. It would probably just be windows. But it served to convey the same sort of message that the Stalinist facades would, and that is that it's an ideal society and everyone is happy and an overall great place to live. And at the end of this road, we finally make it to Alexanderplatz, and we can see the radio tower over there. And over here, we can... Yep. Welcome to Alexanderplatz. And that was our brief tour through Karl-Marx-Allee. And yeah, that's that.